Hi there, and welcome to Academic Half Day Online. This is a series of presentations that will supplement a lot of the learning that you're going to get throughout the course of your academic half days, but because of the size of the curriculum that we have to cover in 2 short years, some of the content we're going to be posting online so that you can review it at your own leisure as opposed to sitting in a lecture and listening to me go on about things. Today's topic is on the function of the liver. Now, for many people who've taken a basic physiology course sometime in medical school, but may have not necessarily taken a more in-depth physiology degree or any other additional courses. And the vast majority of people, the last time they took a physiology course was in the first year of their medical school, and we're now probably in the better part of a decade away since that class. So a lot of the topics that we're covering may seem basic initially, but remember that these are actually topics that you haven't seen in quite some time. You hear about, you may not necessarily study or know as in a greater detail, and this is to serve as a refresher and reminder of all of these things. As well, what I want people to get out of this is to think as I go through all of these, through this lecture, to think about what would the patient look like if this particular system or portion of the system failed, so that you can have a better understanding of what to expect when there is hepatic failure. We're going to cover a number of different topics today. We're going to start off with just a quick overview of the functional anatomy, or the anatomy of the functional unit of the liver, and then we're going to go through all the different cell types that are in there so that you have an understanding of the layout and the histology of the liver. Then we're going to get right into the meat of the matter and talk about the synthetic function and metabolism of the liver, including its metabolism of the glucose, lipid, bile, and protein systems. And then finally finish off with probably one of the more important aspects of liver function in its role in detoxification. So we'll start off at the top with a overview of the functional unit of the and its So the functional unit of the liver is the lobule. Each of these lobules is a hexagon in shape and is built around a vein feeding from the outside of the each of the lobules that comes initially from the portal vein and then drains inward towards the center where the blood drains out towards the hepatic vein. So the blood goes in through the center, towards the center, and as it's going through, it's surrounded by a single layer of hepatocytes that have a very leaky endothelial layer surrounding it that is very permeable, so that the hepatocytes then have a very intimate interaction with the blood and have the ability to perform all of their actions. The hepatocytes are then on the opposite side have all the biochemistry, which drains outward from the center out towards to the outside of each of the lobules that then collects together and forms a bile duct. So blood goes into the middle and bile comes out from the out towards the edges. Now going through each of the individual cell types that are in the liver. The most important one is the hepatocytes. Hepatocytes are obviously the workhorse of the liver. It does all of the functions, and everything that we talk about in the upcoming slides is all going to be the work that the hepatocytes do. Interestingly, on the side where on the endothelial side, hepatocytes actually form a lot of villi type projections into the sinusoidal space, so that they can actually increase the total surface area for absorption and for interaction with the system. So in many respects mimics the function and the structure of the intestinal layer with the villi in the small intestine. The endothelial cells line the sinusoidal and form the membrane around it. Now, unlike a lot of other endothelial cells, there is no basement membrane that forms a barrier between the hepatocytes and the blood layer, which obviously makes sense because you need to have that interaction in order to have the function of the liver. The permeability of the endothelial cells is probably about as close to consistency as wet tissue. It lets a lot of stuff go back and forth. But the endothelial cells themselves also have their own functions. They can perform endocytosis. They do take up some substances, and they are also involved in the inflammatory reaction and can secrete cytokines when stimulated. So they have a lot of those other functions that endothelial cells have in the vascular system. The Kupffer cells are also cells that form a smaller proportion of the total body of the total mass of the liver, and they're the cells that kind of hang out in the sinusoidal lining around these endothelial cells, around the hepatocytes near the blood layer, and they just kind of, they're basically macrophages that scavenge, that gnaw on any denatured proteins they happen across, erythrocytes that have got hung up and aren't going anywhere, and also most importantly any bacteria and immune complexes that might be have started an invasion. The Kupffer cells also participate in inflammation, and they also participate in host defense by stimulating and secreting cytokines and participating in the immune system in that way. There's also a number of cells that are called the stellate cells. These are lipid-filled cells that are primarily there to store vitamin A, and are also responsible for controlling turnover of connective tissue in the extracellular matrix. When these stellate cells are stimulated, they begin the repair of the liver when it's been damaged. Unfortunately, it promotes the production of connective tissue. And so this causes a lot of the scarring and the cirrhosis that we'll see in end-stage liver failure when they're active trying to repair damaged liver segments. And then lastly, there's a small number of cells that are just wanderers around inside the liver called pit cells. And these are natural killer cells that also participate in the immune system by protecting against bacteria, viruses, and any tumor cells that happen to show up. So now we can start getting into the heart of the matter and start discussing some of the different metabolic and synthetic functions that are performed by the liver all the time. We're going to start with one of the more simple substances and probably the most necessary for life, the generation of energy, and that's the glucose metabolism system. As you can well imagine, the liver has an important role in glucose metabolism. Glucose is a primary substance used in most energy systems throughout the body, and the liver is well positioned to control the glucose synthesis and metabolism in its location right in direct connection with the small intestines through the portal vein. So once carbohydrates are broken down in the intestines into glucose, the next stop for this glucose is the liver through the portal vein. This allows the liver to perform a job called glucose buffering, which helps level out the levels of glucose in the system and prevent glucose levels from spiking or dropping too high. And it buffers the glucose by both removing excess glucose during meals and then making it available whenever it's needed. The primary way in which it will buffer is by production of glycogen or the breakdown of glycogen when necessary. Glucose production or glycogen production starts off with the ingestion of the glucose across the hepatocyte membrane. Now, because of the importance of glucose and the desire to maximally absorb it, there's a facilitative transporter that is necessary in order to ensure that all of the possible glucose gets in. This facilitative transporter is a paired channel of sodium with glucose, and it utilizes the sodium concentration gradient into the cell in order to help draw additional glucose in to maximally absorb. Once the glucose is inside the cell, it's rapidly converted to glucose 6-phosphate, which is an important step in the production of glucose and the metabolism of glucose, and then it's converted to glucose 1-phosphate, and then onward to DPG glucose on its way to the production of glycogen through polymerization. Now, the reverse steps of glycogenolysis occurs backwards, where it goes back to glucose 1-phosphate, then back to glucose 6-phosphate, and then back to glucose, and is released into the blood. It's important. The glucose 6-phosphate is an important intermediary step because it is important both to glycogenolysis and glycogenesis. Now, as you are well aware, the pancreas and the beta cells are responsible for the control of insulin throughout the body through the secretion of insulin and glucagon. Insulin is released directly into the portal vein. So again, just like with glucose, insulin's first stop in the system is the liver, and so the liver is the most intimately affected by the levels of insulin in the system. Insulin stimulates glycogenesis. Sorry, I always have trouble with those words. And then also suppresses glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. So insulin promotes the production of glycogen and inhibits the breakdown of glycogen, whereas glucagon and epinephrine do the opposite. Another important function of the liver is the production of glucose. There are some cells within our bodies which cannot live without glucose and have absolutely no other options, and cannot live without this as their substrate, particularly the red blood cells, which have no nucleus and have no way of producing or have no metabolic engine in any way, rely entirely on glucose in order to maintain all of its important metabolic functions. The renal medulla cells also rely heavily on glucose and really can't live without it as its preferred substrate. So gluconeogenesis is necessary in the liver in order to buffer for those times of stress when we don't have enough glycogen, we don't have any ready source of glucose. The liver has to be able to produce glucose de novo in order to supply the body. So basically, gluconeogenesis is the production of glucose from non-carbohydrates. There are a variety of different substances, molecules that can be used to convert into glucose, but the primary sources are lactate, glycerol, adenine, and glutamate. Glutamine are the primary sources and most readily available. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the different enzymatic pathways that are necessary in order to produce glucose from all of the different amino acids, fatty acids, lactates, and so forth. That would just simply take too much time. That's a biochemistry course in its own. But what I'll say is that it's important that you know that the vast majority of these pathways all converge on pyruvate as the fundamental, as the rate-limiting step to the production of glucose. Lactate can be rapidly converted into pyruvate through the use of the LDH enzyme, which you're probably familiar with as as part of the liver function or liver enzymes that we test in the blood. But that enzyme is actually responsible for converting lactate to pyruvate. Once pyruvate is created, it goes through a number of glycolytic path steps to create glucose 6-phosphate, and then it can be converted back into glucose and released into the bloodstream. Fatty acids have to go through a couple of additional steps in order to become pyruvate, and this is primarily first oxidation of fatty acids into fatty acids, and the oxidation of odd chain fatty acids and glycerol are converted into succinyl-CoA and then into acetyl-CoA, which is the step after pyruvate in the glycolytic pathways. And then acetyl-CoA can then be back converted into pyruvate and then onwards onto glucose. Amino acids can be more directly converted into pyruvate. Some of the amino acids are easy to convert and others much less so, depending on the structure of the amino acid. But most of the amino acids are converted by first deamination or transamination in order to convert pyruvate or to convert the amino acid into a pyruvate molecule. Or for those that are a lot more complicated, they can be, when they're deaminated, they actually become similar to steps within the citric acid cycle, and then can just go back through the citric acid cycle back up to acetyl-CoA and then pyruvate. Now remember, this is a metabolic pathway that is responsible for the generation of glucose for the benefit of the other body. It is an energy intense metabolic pathway. And as you can well imagine, it's certainly not a preferred way of providing energy to the rest of the body, because it's consuming more energy than it's actually producing for the rest of the body. Gluconeogenesis is primarily driven from fatty acid metabolism, which makes sense, obviously. If there was enough glucose lying around to burn for fuel, you wouldn't need to be doing any of this. And fatty acids are the most energy dense source available in the body. So speaking of lipids, let's go through some of the basic synthetic function, metabolism and synthesis of lipids. So within lipid metabolism within the liver, there are two major functions that I want to briefly touch on. First is the lipid metabolism of fatty acids, and then next we'll talk about lipoprotein metabolism. Now, free fatty acids can be broken down into their constituent components through a number of steps through beta oxidation, as you can see here, to form acetyl-CoA. This acetyl-CoA is then available as an energy source and can enter the citric acid cycle to help produce ATP. As you can see, these steps are reversible, and so what this means is that any substance that can be converted into acetyl-CoA, hint, everything that goes through the system that is used for producing energy, can be then back converted into fatty acids. So this is how all of that excess glucose that can't be stored or that isn't going to be stored as glycogen gets converted into fat, which then gets stored all over our bodies. The liver also has the ability, through a separate number of enzymatic steps, to saturate fatty acids to create different non-essential fatty acids that can either then elongate them, make them longer if necessary, for a variety of different functions, such as cell membrane integrity, and then can also shorten them as necessary. So the fatty acids are very versatile building blocks as in part of the cells, not only as an energy source, but also as an actual constituent of the cell membrane. The only thing that the liver cannot synthesize from any acetyl-CoA, it can produce fatty acid chains from any acetyl-CoA from any source, but the only thing it can't produce are the essential fatty acids, the omega-3 and the omega-6 fatty acids that we have to consume from our diets. One of the other important functions of the liver is the production of lipoproteins. Lipids, as you can imagine, are not water soluble, and so there has to be a mechanism in order to transport them around. They get fats get digested in the intestines, get converted into fatty acids, they have to be transported in some way in order to into the liver, and then they have to be transported out of the liver to the rest of the body where it can be used either as an energy source or for storage. And so the liver produces lipoproteins, which are necessary, which are used in order to facilitate the transport. So as you can see, lipoproteins are formed as a complex mycel of phospholipids that are then surround a globule of triglycerides and cholesterol esters to transport the to transport these triglycerides. The apolipoproteins are important, as they are essentially the labeler, the identifier that helps the body identify what that substance is, what it's carrying, and whether or not it wants to take it up or not. So to start with, there are essentially 4 different lipoproteins that you need to understand. The first one is the chylomicrons. Now these are formed in the gut and are used to transport the fatty acids to the liver. So it's the fatty acids the fat is broken down into free fatty acids. They're then formed into these chylomicron micelles, and they're transported to the liver, where they're then taken up. The liver produces a lipoprotein called Vldl, which is used to transport triglycerides to the rest of the tissue. So this is the VLDL stands for very low density lipoprotein, which is because it's a very large complex that is very densely packed with triglycerides, so it has a very low density in water because fat floats, obviously. And these triglycerides are then transported around to the body, where the apolipoprotein on the surface of the chylomicron interacts with the endothelium throughout primarily in the adipose tissue, where a lipoprotein lipase will then break it down to extract the triglycerides to use them for energy or for storage. There are a couple of other lipoproteins that are in the system. LDLs are used primarily as a transporter for cholesterol esters from the tissue to the tissue from the liver. So it takes cholesterol and delivers it to the body. And then there's a scavenger lipoprotein called high-density lipoprotein. These are very small, compact lipoproteins, which are predominantly composed on the surface coat of proteins. So they have a much higher density. There's not very much in the lipid core. And the HDLs participate in cholesterol transport more as a scavenger. As it sees free cholesterol floating around, it'll pick it up and help transport it to the system, to the liver for further metabolism. So this is why we regard HDLs as the, quote, good lipoprotein, and LDLs as the bad one, because if you have high levels of LDL, it means you're transporting a lot of cholesterol to the tissue from the liver, and you probably need to take a second look at your diet. You can't do anything about chylomicron levels. That's simply just what is used to transport the free fatty acids from the gut to the liver. So to go into a little bit more detail about cholesterol and bile, we'll talk briefly about the production of bile in the liver, as this is an important job of the liver as part of the process of digesting all of these fats. So cholesterol, unfortunately, gets a bit of a bad rap in the press because of its association with atherosclerosis and coronary diseases. But in fact, cholesterol is an important substance in our bodies because it is used both as a constituent of the cell membrane, as one of its constituents that helps alter the structure and the characteristics of the cell membrane. But it's also used as the substrate for the formation of bile acids. And bile acids are produced in order to help with the digestion of fats, which, again, as we've we've insinuated, although have a bad rap, are kind of important as well because they're a very energy dense source of ATP. And so having a little bit of fat around is actually a good thing because it's a very efficient way to get energy. So it is in the organism's best interest to be able to maximally absorb fats. However, the problem is fats are not water soluble, and so pouring a bunch of enzymes that are water soluble on a fat soluble or a fat rather that doesn't want to interact with water because it's hydrophobic decreases the efficiency of the digestion of fats. So a bile salt can be used to emulsify and help facilitate the breakdown of fats in the digestive tract. And cholesterol is formed, as you can see, through a number of different steps. Cholesterol is formed first into bile salts, and the primary enzyme, primary molecule responsible for that is the cytochrome P450 molecule, which we'll meet again in the near future, and is oxidated to chloric acid and deoxycholic acid, and then through a number of different steps here, which you can see, and I don't think is terribly important that you actually know or memorize unless you're in biochemistry, creates a series of bile acids. Before the liver actually secretes these bile acids, it conjugates the bile acids with glycine or tauruine, which are amino acids, and these amino acids then create what is at first, or is what is initially very hydrophobic. It makes it much more water soluble so that it can be much more effective in emulsifying fats. The bile acids are now called bile salts, and they are released into the first into the gallbladder, then into the digestive tract, where they assist in the breakdown of these fats. Once they get through the gut, there is actually an enterohepatic circulation. When gut bacteria get a hold of these bile salts, they will actually deconjugate them, removing the amino acid that was present on it. And I don't know why they do that. Maybe because it's a yummy source of nutrition. Or just maybe it's out of the goodness of their hearts, I don't know. But either way, now these bile salts can be then reabsorbed and then returned to the liver so that you're not necessarily always producing an obscene amount of bile acids or having to constantly produce bile acids. You can actually recycle and reuse what you have. So a very green system. One of the effects of many of the medications we give for elevated cholesterol is to impede the reabsorption of bile acids, so that cholesterol needs to be used to constantly produce more bile salt. The next substance that we're going to talk about for metabolism and synthesis in the liver is the production of proteins. This diagram is not something that you necessarily need to memorize, but it serves as a reminder for those of you who don't quite recall all of the steps in the production of proteins. There's nothing special in the liver about the production of proteins. The liver produces protein just like every other cell in the body through a series of RNA translation and protein synthesis. But the liver is a major organ responsible for the synthesis of non-essential amino acids. So not just producing just raw proteins, but actually producing the building blocks using a variety of different metabolic pathways. It can take even glucose molecules or acetyl-CoA, and it can actually create a non-essential amino acid. Now, as you know, an essential amino acid is one that we can't produce on our own from any other pathway and has to be consumed through our diet. And it'll use these processes of interconversion and also some of the 9 essential amino acids to produce whatever amino acid that is necessary. So the liver has a really important job in that, in the control and production of non-essential amino acids if they're not available readily in the diet. But probably its most important role is the production of protein through a variety of different pathways to create a lot of different substances, of which the list is almost endless, but that includes most importantly the production of albumin, all the coagulation proteins, anticoagulation, fibrinolytic proteins, transferrin, haptoglobin, and many other substances and proteins that are necessary for life. Another important function the hepatocytes perform as part of protein synthesis is controlling and metabolizing ammonia. Whenever amino acids are deaminated, there's an ammonia molecule that has to be dealt with, and as a byproduct of this metabolism, the liver's primary responsibility is to deal with it. Now, ammonia is primarily metabolized to urea using the urea cycle, so that the urea, which is non-toxic and water-soluble, can then be excreted by the kidneys. Ammonia by itself can be fairly toxic, as you know, with patients with hepatic encephalopathy, you don't want a lot of free ammonia floating around causing problems. So the liver takes all of this excess ammonia that's floating around, metabolizes it, converts it into finally urea, and then allows it to be last topic I want to go through is one that I found particularly interesting, because we talk about it, we assume it, we don't really, and many times don't actually really fully understand it, and yet one of the most important functions the liver performs, in addition to all of its metabolic role, is the detoxification. And this is a really interesting function because there is in fact an infinite number of different substances in the environment that can be ingested, and and the vast majority of them are ingested. We don't know what it is, so we eat it to see what happens, and it turns out to be fairly toxic. Or never mind things that are toxic in and of themselves. Food itself, and many have a variety of toxic substances as part of its makeup, and the liver has to be able to have a way of metabolizing it in order to get rid of things that are not food, but not good to have in the system. So basically, because there's an infinite number of substances, and because the liver can't predict what it's going to be exposed to, it can't produce a specific metabolic pathway to metabolize something that it may never be exposed to, because that's a waste of energy. And it also can't, if it's exposed to something that's completely novel, has never been created before, it has to have a way of generating dealing with it as well. So the liver has to have a fairly generic pathway, which I think is actually a fairly eloquent system of managing all of these unknown toxins. And the liver itself is well positioned both anatomically and physiologically to deal with degrading these substances. As I said, most things get into our body through our mouth, and then the intestines are through the portal vein are a direct connection to the liver. So the liver really gets first crack at stopping anything that could be potentially toxic from getting into the rest of the system and causing all kinds of havoc. Now, just for the sake of simplicity, we will consider that any substance that's toxic that's hydrophilic, so that is very water soluble, would typically be filtered out by the kidneys, because the kidney itself would not have a mechanism for reabsorbing anything that goes into the ultrafiltrate. So it would assume that anything that gets into the blood that's hydrophilic gets filtered, and in the kidneys it would just continue to go out through the urine. So for the sake of argument, just assume that anything that's hydrophilic is largely excreted by the kidneys because of the filtration. But in order to handle hydrophobic molecules, things that are water or fat soluble, you need to use a different setup in order to get rid of those, because they won't be filtered. They won't go into the kidneys. So in order to metabolize these substances and get them ready for excretion, the kidneys go through the liver goes through a two-step process of phase 1 and phase 2 in order to create something that's hydrophobic and make it hydrophilic. Phase 1 is a reaction that is used to expose a hydroxy or a carboxyl group on that substance. So depending on the chemical structure of the substance, the enzyme will look for a specific substrate somewhere on that molecule, and then using an oxidation or a hydrolysis reaction will then expose an extra oxygen or a hydroxy group to that to the enzyme. Then there's the phase 2 reaction, and phase 2 then takes adds a negatively charged group such as a glycine or sulfate or a glutathione, and conjugates it to it, much like you see with the bile, converting a bile acid to a bile salt. By adding on this extra molecule that's negatively charged, it creates a hydrophilic substance. Then once it's hydrophilic, the liver lets it go into the blood. It's now water soluble. It goes out to the kidneys, and it's filtered, and it's gone, and the problems are solved. So there are a number of enzymes that participate in this reaction. But the most important one that I want you to understand is the cytochrome P450 dependent monooxygenase enzymes that do the bulk of the work. And the picture on the left is a diagram of the P45 molecule. The P45 enzyme group is actually a dimer of two enzymes. The first one is a P450 reductase, which is used to generate electrons from the reduction of FAD and MHN to using NHDPH to NADP. So it produces a free electron that then goes through to the next molecule, the actual cytochrome P450 molecule, which is the electron acceptor, and then uses oxygen to bind the substances to catalyze the reaction of the R, where R stands for any substance, H being the hydrogen ion attached to it, plus oxygen, to create the hydroxy group of the ROH to the H2O with H2O reaction. There are many different isoforms of this enzyme in this group. The vast majority of them are the cytochrome P450 family, is the group 3A4, which approximately constitutes approximately 60% of all of the cytochrome P450 in the liver. This enzyme is important because it can be affected by the inhibition. It can be affected by the inhibition of many substances, particularly by substances like, say, for example, grapefruit juice. So it's a 3A4 enzyme that's inhibited by grapefruit juice now has is essentially competitively inhibited by the grapefruit juice, and it can't metabolize substances that it normally would. This is seen most markedly in people who are taking HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors. That's why they are specifically warned not to drink grapefruit juice, because by taking in fruit juice, the metabolism of HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors goes down, the levels build up in the body, and they cause all of the side effects of that medication class. A good example of a substance that's metabolized through the P450 pathways that's relevant to critical care is the metabolism of acetaminophen. Acetaminophen of itself is not toxic, but becomes toxic by virtue of the way in which it's metabolized. Now, the vast majority of acetaminophen is actually directly conjugated through gluconeogenesis or sulfonation to produce a hydrophilic substance that can be then just renally excreted. But about 10% of the acetaminophen actually goes through a P450 pathway using an isoform called the 2E4 cytochrome, which is then metabolized into a substance called NAPQI, which you can see at the bottom of the slide. Now, this is a very toxic substance that causes direct hepatocellular death. But fortunately, this is only phase 1 of a 2-phase reaction, and NAPQI is quickly converted through a phase 2 reaction by conjugation with glutathione into a non-toxic substance that then can be rapidly excreted into the urine. However, when you take an overdose of acetaminophen, the sulfonation and gluconeogenesis pathways are rapidly saturated and forces the larger proportion of the acetaminophen down through the phase 1, phase 2 pathway of the cytochrome P450. And so this cytochrome 2E1 has to then manage more than it's used to, and produces a lot more NAPQI. Now, unfortunately, there's not enough glutathione in the liver on a regular daily basis in order to participate in the conjugation, and so the levels of NAPQI can rapidly build up to very toxic levels, and this causes metabolic intermediary step can then start conjugating with other proteins or with nucleic acids. It's basically going around looking for something to stick to, and when it does that, it causes a lot of damage. The reason why we give N-acetylcysteine to people who have overdosed on acetaminophen is because it provides a cysteine, which is molecule, which is a precursor for the production of glutathione. So once there's a sufficient amount of glutathione available in the hepatocytes, all of this toxic NAPQI can then be rapidly conjugated and be made non-toxic. This is an example of the consequences of co-ingestions. When alcohol is consumed, or either acutely or chronically, it tends to induce the activity of the cytochrome 450 2E1 molecule, upregulating it, and actually increases the proportion of acetaminophen that gets shuttled down this pathway. And so the acetaminophen toxicity can occur at a much lower dose. So you'll have a substance, you'll have something that at normal concentrations wouldn't be bothering it, but because of upregulation of the cytochrome, can become rapidly toxic. And so this is why we see alcoholics who can become very sick with Tylenol, even though they've taken a relatively small dose of Tylenol. It's because of the activation or upregulation of that particular molecule responsible for the production of NAPQI. So I think we've covered enough for today, but what I want you to focus on in going over this is to consider knowing these functions of the liver. You should be able to then better anticipate the consequences of liver failure. What are the consequences when the liver fails? What are the consequences of bile acid production, protein production, glucose metabolism, and glucose buffering? What are the consequences when you lose the ability to detoxify rapidly, either in either phase 1 or phase 2? What are the consequences of protein metabolism and ammonia shuttling to the urea cycle? These are all important functions that the liver provides, and by understanding these functions, you can then better anticipate what you would expect to see whenever you have when you're presented with a patient with hepatic failure. So So in conclusion, just wanted to thank you for your time, and I hope you found this useful. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment section below in this video.